In 1886, a French aristocrat named Alexandre Saint-Yves d'Alvidre finished a manuscript that would have changed his reputation forever, and not in the way he wanted. The book was called Mission de l'Inde, and in it, Saint-Yves made a claim so extraordinary that even his closest allies begged him to suppress it. He described in painstaking detail a vast subterranean kingdom called Agartha, hidden beneath the surface of the earth, governed by a supreme pontiff called the Brahmatma. It was home to millions of inhabitants and possessed technology and spiritual knowledge that made surface civilization look backwards. And here's what makes the whole thing genuinely strange. Saint-Yves wasn't a fringe thinker by any means. He was a well-connected and widely respected political theorist with friends in high places, a man who'd spent years developing a model of ideal governance he called synarchy. He destroyed all but 2 copies of the book before his death, but a few survived, and the idea he tried to bury refused to stay underground. To understand how Agartha lodged itself so deeply in the Western imagination, we've got to go back further than the original idea itself. The notion that the earth might be hollow, or that civilizations might exist beneath the crust, is genuinely ancient. Mythologies across the world describe underworlds, from the Greek Hades to the Hindu Patala, from the Norse Svartalfheim to the Aztec Mictlan. These weren't always places of punishment, and in many traditions, the underworld was simply another realm, populated by beings with their own rules and their own hierarchies. But the idea shifted from mythology to something resembling early science in 1692. The English astronomer Edmund Halley, the same man who predicted the return of Halley's Comet, proposed a hollow Earth model to the Royal Society of London. Halley was trying to explain anomalies in compass readings, and his model suggested the Earth consisted of concentric shells, each potentially capable of supporting life. It was wrong, obviously, but it was a genuinely serious hypothesis from a serious scientist working with the tools available to him at the time. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the hollow Earth had become a fixture of speculative thought. The American Army officer John Cleves Sims spent the 1820s petitioning the United States Congress to fund an expedition to the North Pole. He believed a massive opening led into the Earth's interior, and though he didn't get his funding, he got a surprising amount of public attention. The idea that something might exist beneath our feet, something vast and hidden and possibly intelligent, had a grip on people that pure debunking simply couldn't shake. Saint-Yves d'Alvidre didn't invent the hollow Earth, but he gave it a name, a government, and a purpose. His version of Agartha was a functioning civilization, spiritually advanced, technologically superior, and organized according to the principles of synarchy. This was his own political philosophy, almost Confucian in nature, which emphasized rule by a harmonious elite. He claimed to have learned about Agartha from a mysterious figure he identified only as a Hindu informant named Haji Sharif. This name would, of course, be highly unusual for someone who's Hindu, given that it's a very clearly Islamic name, but believers accepted this was an anonymization of the original source. This man reportedly taught him Sanskrit and introduced him to esoteric Eastern traditions. What made Saint-Yves' account so compelling was its specificity, since he didn't just wave his hands and say there was a kingdom underground. He described its libraries, its universities, its government structure, and wrote about how Agartha's inhabitants had mastered technologies that surface humanity hadn't yet conceived of. He placed the kingdom somewhere beneath Central Asia, connected to the surface through hidden tunnels in the Himalayas and other mountain ranges. He argued that Agartha's leaders had been quietly influencing the course of human history from below. The fact that he tried to destroy the book only added to its mystique. Mission de l'Inde was finally published posthumously in 1910, and by then, the legend had taken on a life of its own. Supporters of Agartha believed that the text had been suppressed by the authorities, while detractors agreed on the suppression, but believed his colleagues did it for his own sake. The next major chapter in the Agartha story came from a very different kind of figure. In 1922, the Polish scientist and explorer Ferdynand Ossendowski published Beasts, Men, and Gods, an account of his harrowing journey through Mongolia. Ossendowski claimed that during his travels, Mongolian lamas and princes had told him about a subterranean kingdom ruled by a figure called the King of the World. This ruler, they said, could command the forces of nature, communicated telepathically with the surface, and would one day emerge to usher in a new age. Ossendowski's book was a sensation, and it sold widely across Europe and America, and brought the idea of an underground kingdom to a mass audience for the first time. But it also brought scrutiny, especially because this wasn't specifically called Agartha. The French esotericist René Guénon, who published his own book on the subject, Le Roi du Monde, in 1927, argued that Ossendowski had likely drawn on Saint-Yves' earlier work. Guénon took the concept in a more explicitly metaphysical direction, treating Agartha less as a literal underground city and more as a spiritual center of the world. The tension between these two interpretations, literal and symbolic, has defined the Agartha conversation ever since. Some believers treat it as a real physical place, while others treat it as an allegory for hidden spiritual knowledge. A not insignificant number of people have tried to split the difference, arguing that the truth is somehow both, that it both exists and does not exist. It's essentially impossible to talk about Agartha without addressing the uncomfortable territory of its adoption by occult-tinged elements within the Third Reich. During the 1920s and 1930s, various fringe groups in Germany became fascinated with the idea of a hollow earth and the advanced beings supposedly dwelling within it. The Vril Society, named after a fictional energy source from an 1871 novel, reportedly believed in a subterranean group that had harnessed the all-powerful energy, also called Vril. Now, the extent to which the Vril Society actually existed as a formal organization versus being a later invention of post-war mythmakers is a matter of genuine scholarly debate. Much of what's been written about it traces back to a rather fantastical 1960 book called The Morning of the Magicians, which contains a mix of fact and legend. What is well documented is that Heinrich Himmler and elements within the SS had a serious interest in occult archaeology. This included funding expeditions to Tibet and other locations in search of evidence supporting their mythologies. Whether Agartha specifically featured in their beliefs, or whether that connection was amplified after, remains hotly contested. One of the more interesting threads in the Agartha story is its relationship to the Buddhist concept of Shambhala. In Tibetan Buddhist tradition, Shambhala is a hidden kingdom, sometimes described as existing in a valley beyond the Himalayas. It's sometimes described as a physical place, but other times as an entirely spiritual realm, accessible only through meditation and enlightenment. The Kalachakra Tantra, a major Tibetan Buddhist text, describes Shambhala as a place where the Dharma has been preserved in its purest form, ruled by a line of enlightened kings. The overlap with the Agartha legend is hard to miss, especially given the two sources from which the Agartha legend sprung up in the West. It's a hidden kingdom in Central Asia, governed by a wise ruler, preserving ancient knowledge, destined to play a decisive role in the future of humanity. It's very likely that Saint-Yves, Ossendowski, and other Western writers drew on garbled or second-hand accounts of the Shambhala tradition when constructing their narratives. But there's an important distinction, and in traditional Buddhist teaching, Shambhala isn't necessarily a place you can walk to. It's mostly interpreted as a spiritual reality, accessible through practice and realization. The Western Agartha tradition, by contrast, has tended to literalize the concept, turning it into something you could theoretically find with enough maps and enough digging. Agartha persists, and one common question is why the idea has such staying power. Part of the answer is probably psychological. Humans have always been drawn to the idea that there's more to the world than what we can see. The notion that something vast and meaningful might be hidden just out of reach speaks to a deep and persistent longing. It's the same impulse that drives interest in lost continents, ancient astronauts, and hidden chambers beneath the Sphinx. The most famous Viking who ever lived, the man whose name is practically synonymous with the entire Viking Age, may never have existed at all. Or perhaps he existed, but wasn't one man. Or he was one man, but almost nothing we think we know about him is true. The historical record doesn't give us a clean answer, and the deeper you dig, the murkier it gets. This is the story of the legendary Viking Ragnar Lothbrok, and the debate that's been surrounding him for over a millennium. Most people's understanding of Ragnar Lothbrok comes filtered through the History Channel series, and there's nothing wrong with that as a starting point. But strip away the dramatization, and what you're left with is a figure from Old Norse saga literature who reportedly conquered vast territories. He raided Paris, fathered a dynasty of legendary warrior sons, and met his end in a snake pit in the court of King Aella of Northumbria. It's an incredible story, but it also doesn't hold up particularly well under historical scrutiny. The name itself is the first thing worth pausing on, since Lothbrok roughly translates to shaggy pants. According to tradition, the name came from a pair of specially treated hide trousers his wife Aslaug made for him as protection against serpents. Already we're likely firmly in the territory of folklore rather than biography, given how he supposedly perished. No serious historian treats the origin story of his name as anything other than a narrative device layered onto the character long after the events it supposedly describes. The trouble with Ragnar is that the major sources describing his life were all composed centuries after the period in which he supposedly lived. The Gesta Danorum, written in Latin around 1200 by the Danish chronicler Saxo Grammaticus, provides one of the earliest extended accounts. Saxo was working from a combination of older Norse histories, Icelandic oral traditions, and earlier chronicles, notably drawing on the work of Adam of Bremen from around 1075. His version of Ragnar is a Danish king of extraordinary ambition who appoints his sons to govern territories stretching from Scotland to the river systems of Central Asia. It's a claim so expansive it immediately invites skepticism, though given the range of Vikings, it's not entirely impossible he wasn't claiming that they were sent to China, for instance. Then there's the Ragnar Saga, an Icelandic legendary saga composed in the 13th century. This text gives us the most detailed narrative of Ragnar's life, his marriages, his exploits, and his dramatic death. Complementing it is the tale of Ragnar's sons, which shifts focus to the next generation and their campaigns of vengeance across England. A poem called the Krakumal, meanwhile, purports to be Ragnar's own death song, recited as he perished in the snake pit, recounting his battles across a vast geographical range. These are rich and compelling sources, but of course they are also inherently flawed. Their literary compositions, written 300 to 400 years after the events they describe, shaped by the political and cultural needs of their own time. The sagas weren't history in the sense we'd understand them today, but something more akin to historical fiction. They were entertainment, cultural preservation, and political legitimation all woven together. They were working within a tradition where embellishment and conflation of historical figures was standard practice seen as entirely acceptable. But here's the thing. That doesn't mean there isn't a seed of historical truth in the legend, because there definitely is. If there's a single thread connecting the legend to something concrete, it's the siege of Paris in 845. Frankish annals record that in March of that year, a fleet of roughly 120 Viking ships, carrying more than 5,000 warriors, sailed up the Seine. According to these annals, they were under the command of a powerful Viking chieftain called Regin Harris. This force sacked Paris and extracted a massive ransom of 7,000 pounds of silver from the Frankish king Charles the Bald before withdrawing. Regin Harris is only known from this single raid. He appears, does something extraordinary, and then vanishes from the Frankish records entirely. Interestingly, the name Ragnar can be rendered as Regner, and could plausibly be a shortened form of Regin Harris. Alternatively, Regin Harris might be an attempt to Latinize an unfamiliar Old Norse name. Several historians have suggested that this raider was the historical kernel around which the Ragnar legend eventually crystallized. The connection is tantalizing but far from proven, since even if it's true, the name Ragnar itself was exceedingly common. We're essentially matching a common Norse name across sources written in different languages, in different countries, centuries apart. The most iconic element of the Ragnar story, his execution by King Aelle of Northumbria via a pit full of venomous serpents, is also one of the most historically dubious. There's no archaeological evidence that snake pits were constructed or used for execution anywhere in the British Isles during this period. More importantly, the motif isn't original to Ragnar, and all evidence suggests that it became something of a trope. The Poetic Edda contains at least 2 separate poems describing the Burgundian king Gunnar being thrown into a snake pit by Attila the Hun. This is a story that predates the Ragnar tradition, and almost certainly influenced it. Some believe later writers were borrowing a dramatic death from an existing literary stockpile and attaching it to their hero. The Krakumal, that supposed death poem, doesn't help establish historicity either. Scholars have dated its composition to the 12th century at the earliest, placing it firmly in the era of saga composition rather than the Viking Age itself. It reads less like a preserved oral tradition and more like a literary exercise designed to give Ragnar a suitably heroic send-off. Here's where the story takes its most interesting turn. While Ragnar himself remains stubbornly elusive in the historical record, his supposed sons are remarkably well documented. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a near-contemporary English source, records that in 865, a massive Viking force known as the Great Heathen Army invaded East Anglia. They were under the leadership of Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan Ragnarsson, and Ubba. These are real, historically attested individuals whose campaigns reshaped the political map of England. The sagas claim the invasion was motivated by revenge for Ragnar's death at Aelle's hands. The Chronicle also confirms that Aelle of Northumbria perished during the Viking conquest of York in 867. But the Chronicle itself never mentions Ragnar, never references a snake pit, and never frames the invasion as an act of vengeance. The revenge narrative appears only in later Norse sources. These sources had every reason to retroactively provide a dramatic motivation for what may have simply been an opportunistic military campaign. This is the central paradox. His sons were undeniably real, their campaigns documented in multiple independent sources. But the father who supposedly united them, that man exists only in texts written long after the fact, in texts that freely mix historical events with legendary material. The scholarly consensus that's emerged is that Ragnar Lothbrok is most likely a composite figure. He was likely a literary creation assembled from the deeds of several real Viking leaders whose exploits were gradually merged into a single legendary biography. Reginhirus may have contributed one layer, but other Viking chieftains active in Ireland, Francia, and England during the mid-9th century likely contributed others. The saga authors, working centuries later, wove these threads into a coherent narrative because that's what sagas do. They create order and meaning out of the chaos of history. This doesn't make Ragnar unimportant, and if anything, it makes him more interesting. A single Viking raider is a footnote, but a legendary figure who absorbed the achievements of an entire generation of Norse warriors is something different entirely. He became the symbolic father of a dynasty that reshaped medieval Europe, and that's a phenomenon worth understanding. Ragnar Lothbrok tells us less about what actually happened in the 9th century and more about how the Norse world wanted to remember itself. Perhaps that's the most honest thing we can say about the most famous Viking, is that the legend became more real than any single person behind it could have ever have been. A millennia later, that legend is still doing exactly what the saga authors designed it to do, and is still entertaining people today. After all, had these authors not made Ragnar a larger-than-life figure, the life of any of the individual Vikings who composed him likely wouldn't have been made into a show. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here asking you to hit the like and subscribe buttons if you're enjoying this video. Also, don't forget to hit that share button and send my content to anyone you know who appreciates historical content and history mysteries. In the year 476, a teenage emperor with the absurdly grand name Romulus Augustus, a name that literally combined Rome's mythical founder with its first emperor, was quietly removed. A barbarian general named Odoacer did it, and he didn't even bother claiming the throne for himself, choosing to present himself as a vassal of Eastern Rome. He packed the teenager off to a comfortable villa in Campania with a generous pension and sent the imperial regalia east to Constantinople. And just like that, according to centuries of textbooks, the ancient world ended and the Middle Ages began. There's just one problem with this version of events. Almost nobody alive at the time seems to have noticed or cared. If you went through a Western education system at any point in the last 150 years, you were almost certainly taught that the medieval period began in 476. It's clean, it's dramatic, and it fits the narrative we like to tell ourselves about history. That civilizations rise, they peak, they collapse, and then something new emerges. The deposition of Romulus Augustus by Odoacer, a Germanic chieftain who'd been serving as a mercenary commander in the Roman army, became the convenient symbolic bookend. But here's the thing. The people living through it didn't experience a clean break. The Roman Senate continued to meet, and Roman law still governed daily life across much of Italy. Churches kept their doors open, aqueducts kept running, and Latin remained the language of administration and learning. The entire eastern half of the empire, which we now call the Byzantine Empire, carried on for nearly another 1,000 years, with its capital in Constantinople. The idea that civilization simply switched off at a single date and time is a story we imposed on the past much later, not one that the people of the 5th century would have recognized. The version of history that most of us inherited owes an enormous debt to Edward Gibbon, who published his magnum opus between 1776 and 1789. His 6-volume work on the decline and fall of the Roman Empire became one of the most influential books ever written. It cemented the idea that Rome's collapse was a catastrophic civilizational failure caused by moral decay, the spread of Christianity, and the onslaught of barbarian invasions. In this framework, the medieval period wasn't just what came after Rome, it was a direct consequence of Rome's failure. The Dark Ages label, though it actually predates this work by several centuries, drew much of its popular staying power from this narrative. The problem is that the picture this framework paints is dramatically oversimplified. It treats the end of the Western Roman Empire as a single event rather than a process that unfolded over generations, and it frames everything that followed as decline. More recent scholarship has pushed back hard against this, arguing that the transition from antiquity to the medieval world was far more gradual. One of the most provocative challenges to the 476 date came from a Belgian historian writing in the early 20th century. His central argument, published posthumously in 1937, was startling in its simplicity. The real break between the ancient and medieval worlds wasn't the fall of Rome at all. It was the rise of Islam. And his reasoning went like this. Even after the Germanic kingdoms replaced Roman political authority in the West, the Mediterranean world remained culturally and economically unified. Trade networks persisted, and the flow of goods continued to circulate across the old Roman Mediterranean. What shattered that unity wasn't Odoacer or the Visigoths or the Vandals. It was the Arab conquests of the 7th and 8th centuries, which severed the Mediterranean trade routes and cut Western Europe off from the wealth of the East. In this reading, the medieval world, with its feudal economies, its agrarian focus, and its political fragmentation, didn't begin until the 7th or 8th century. This thesis was enormously influential, and it remains hotly debated today. Starting in the 1970s, another school of thought emerged that questioned the entire premise of the debate. Rather than arguing about exactly when antiquity ended and when the medieval period began, they got around it by creating a liminal space between antiquity and the medieval world. A generation of scholars proposed that the centuries between roughly 250 and 750 constituted their own distinct period, which they called late antiquity. This was its own thing, with its own cultural achievements, its own intellectual movements, and its own logic. This approach emphasized continuity rather than the traditional rupture and collapse narrative. The spread of Christianity, the gradual transformation of Roman institutions, the emergence of new art forms and literary traditions, and the development of monasticism are all pointed to as innovations. All of these were treated as creative responses to changing circumstances rather than symptoms of decay. The world of the 5th and 6th centuries wasn't a broken version of Rome, and besides, Rome in the East hadn't fallen anyway. It had just transformed into something far more Hellenic. This reframing has been enormously productive for the field, but it certainly hasn't settled the debate. Some historians have argued that the late antiquity framework romanticizes a period that, for many ordinary people, involved genuine hardship. There was population decline, urban contraction, loss of literacy, and significantly increased violence. The archaeological record shows that in many parts of the former Western Roman Empire, material living standards dropped significantly between the 5th and 7th centuries. Calling this a transformation rather than a decline can feel like a bizarre academic euphemism more than anything else. The 476 date, the Arab conquest thesis, and the late antiquity framework aren't the only options on the table. Some historians have pointed to 410, when Alaric and the Visigoths sacked Rome for the first time in 800 years, as the true psychological turning point. Others have suggested 529 as a symbolic starting point, since that year saw the closing of the famous Philosophical Academy in Athens. Still others have argued for 568, when the Lombards invaded Italy and shattered what remained of the old Roman administrative framework on the peninsula. And some scholars, particularly those focused on British history, point to the withdrawal of Roman legions from Britain and the subsequent Anglo-Saxon migrations as the relevant starting point. It was the point where the empire began to lose core territory permanently, even if it was located in a periphery region of the empire. The date we choose for the beginning of the Middle Ages reflects a set of assumptions about what matters in history. If we pick 476, we're centering the story on political authority and the Roman state. If we follow the Arab conquest thesis, we're prioritizing economics and the Mediterranean world over Western Europe. If we embrace the ideas of late antiquity, we're arguing that cultural transformation matters more than political collapse. Each choice foregrounds certain developments and backgrounds others, and each one fundamentally shapes how the medieval world emerged from the ancient one. In the end, though, ultimately, antiquity and medieval are a vibe, and we know vibes when we feel them. On a rainy October day in 1849, a figure was found collapsed outside a Baltimore tavern, delirious, muddied, and dressed in shabby clothes that didn't appear to be his own. Passers-by were stunned to realize the man in the gutter was none other than Edgar Allan Poe, the famed author of eerie tales and poems. He was quickly taken to Washington College Hospital for treatment, but in the 4 days leading up to his death on October 7th, Poe never fully regained consciousness. Instead, he drifted in and out of delirium, reportedly plagued by vivid hallucinations. The night before he died, according to his attending physician, Dr. John Moran, Poe even cried out repeatedly for someone named Reynolds, a mysterious reference that's unexplained. Early that Sunday morning, Edgar Allan Poe died at age 40. The official cause recorded as phrenitis, or swelling of the brain, a vague diagnosis used at the time. In his death, he would create a mystery as perplexing and macabre as one of his own stories. Poe's final journey began with high hopes. He spent the summer of 1849 in Richmond, Virginia, pursuing a new literary venture while recovering from a serious illness. While there, he rekindled a romance with an old sweetheart and planned to remarry, looking toward a brighter future. On September 27th, 1849, Poe departed Richmond, intending to travel north via Baltimore to Philadelphia and then to New York. Yet somewhere along this route, Edgar Allan Poe vanished. He never arrived in Philadelphia, nor did he reach New York as planned. For nearly a week, the writer's whereabouts were completely unknown. It wasn't until October 3rd that he resurfaced in the worst possible state. That day, Poe was found slumped near a polling station in Baltimore, incoherent and in distress. This sudden reappearance, with Poe in dire condition and far off course from his intended journey, only deepened the mystery surrounding his final days. Poe spent his remaining hours confined at the hospital, largely alone and delirious. He was kept in a section reserved for patients found intoxicated, and no visitors were allowed to see him. The only witness to his last moments was Dr. John Moran. He described Poe as slipping in and out of consciousness, rambling in complete delirium. The doctor claimed that Poe's final words were a soft plea for God to help my poor soul, uttered in the early hours of October 7th. However, Moran's credibility has since come under scrutiny. Throughout the years, Moran told inconsistent versions of Poe's last days, leading many to doubt his testimony. With all medical records now lost to history, separating fact from fiction in Poe's final hours is impossible. Despite being well known in his own time, Poe's funeral was a brief and sparsely attended affair. Only a few family members and close friends braved the damp, chilly weather to see him laid to rest. In the aftermath, Poe's reputation suffered almost as much as his body did in his final days. A hostile obituary written by his rival Rufus Griswold maligned Poe as a drunken, depraved madman with numerous false or exaggerated claims. published under a pseudonym, this libelous piece was widely read and, for a time, accepted as truth. It helped cement the image of Poe dying in disgrace due to alcoholism, a strong stigma at the time that would cling to his legacy for years. Meanwhile, the real cause of Poe's death remained uncertain, and it soon became the subject of intense speculation. For decades, many assumed that Poe simply drank himself to death, as was commonly stated in the media of the time. Poe's collapse and delirium were easily attributed to alcohol by his contemporaries, and his story was used as a case study in alcoholic degeneracy by the temperance movement. Over time, however, the alcohol theory has been widely challenged. Poe did struggle with drinking, but he wasn't the habitual drunk that many imagined. Friends noted that Poe had a severe sensitivity to alcohol. Even one glass of wine could leave him staggering, and that he often abstained for months at a time. In fact, Poe was a member of the Sons of Temperance, and by all accounts stayed sober during his final period in Richmond. Thus, while Poe had periods of excess in his life, modern experts doubt that alcohol alone can account for the peculiar circumstances of his death. That said, it does remain a serious possibility, as he could have relapsed into a severe binge episode. One of the most enduring and bizarre theories is that Poe was the victim of a violent election scam known as cooping. In 19th century Baltimore, gangs would kidnap unsuspecting individuals, force them to drink, and then disguise them to vote multiple times under different names. Such voter fraud was rampant in Baltimore at the time, and tellingly, Poe was found on Election Day outside a polling site notorious for cooping activity. The cooping theory neatly explains several oddities of Poe's case, such as why he was discovered in an incoherent state and why he was wearing clothes that didn't belong to him. However, others have noted that Poe was a well-known and distinctive-looking figure, and no one reported seeing him brought to any polling stations. Despite some skepticism, cooping remains one of the most plausible explanations for Poe's untimely fate. Cooping isn't the only foul play scenario that has been suggested, though the others are rather straightforward accounts of him being beat up and robbed by random thugs or goons. Apart from external foul play, a host of medical explanations have been proposed for Poe's baffling end. Over the years, scholars and doctors have retroactively diagnosed Poe with a litany of ailments, including heart disease, diabetes, epilepsy, meningitis, cholera, syphilis, and more. Among the more prominent theories is rabies. In 1996, a medical study of Poe's symptoms concluded that he exhibited classic signs of rabies infection. However, the major problem with this theory is that there's no evidence whatsoever to indicate that he was bit by a rabid animal. Contemporary physicians were familiar with the concept of rabies, and as an interesting aside, it's actually one of the first medical conditions ever documented. In ancient Samaria, a portion of a text was discovered, which warned people that dog bites can spread a fatal disease, but only under certain rare and unusual conditions. Other diagnoses focus on more ordinary illnesses. One hypothesis suggests Poe succumbed to influenza that developed into deadly pneumonia. He had been ill before leaving Richmond and was caught in cold, rainy weather in Baltimore, factors which could have led to a severe fever and delirium. Perhaps the most eerie theory involves a brain tumor. When Poe's body was exhumed in 1875 to be moved to a new grave, witnesses noted a strange calcified mass inside his skull. More than 170 years later, the truth behind Edgar Allan Poe's death still remains elusive, with no single theory proving definitive. In the end, the man who redefined mystery and horror left behind a legacy that no amount of sleuthing is able to crack.